Very good. All right. You know, my wife would say if my head wasn't tied on tight, I would lose it anyway. Okay. What excuse did I have when I was younger? Now I can say, you know, I'm getting old and I forget things. Okay. Sefer Shmot. Now, as I've mentioned before, and we'll go into that a little bit more tonight because we're going to start talking about the Hebrew Bible. Its Hebrew name is taken from one of the opening words, El Shmot. These are the names, so it's known as Shmot. In English, based upon the translation of the Septuagint, it is referred to as Exodus, which is actually from the Latin, leading out, going out of the land of Egypt, because that is the major content of at least the first half of the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmot, while the second half will deal with the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So it begins by telling the story of how Pharaoh enslaves the Jewish people slowly and gets them into having to build various institutions, buildings and things for him. And while that's going on, the children of Israel still continue to expand in numbers. There's all kinds of interesting midrashim trying to explain that. We'll skip over them. But then he finally decides that he's going to have the midwives, when they come to deliver the children, to have them slay the male children so that they will not be able to reproduce. But the girls they can leave alive. But the Torah says that these midwives, who are called Shifra and Puah, according to the Midrash, they're Miriam and her mother who take care of the children, right? The mother of Moses. So anyway, the second chapter talks about a man from the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she conceives and has a child. And this is Moses, and they hide him for a period of time until finally they can no longer do it. And so finally, the mother decides to take Moshe, although his Hebrew name is not really given here yet, put him in a wicker basket and put him into the Nile River to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh sees him, takes him, adopts him into her household. And so Moshe, at least according to the biblical account here, he's named Moshe because she drew him, Mashui ki min hamayim mishitahu. Right? They drew him out of the water. So the Torah suggests the name of Moshe somehow is related to being drawn out of the water. Now we do know that in Egyptian culture, the name Moses was a common name applied to God, Thutmoses, all right, for example. And so Moses could be an Egyptian name, Moses, coming from the Egyptian, and then it was transliterated into the Hebrew, and in accordance, of course, biblical critics, which we'll talk about later tonight, would suggest that the name was changed into a Hebrew name and then given the rationale for it from this story, even though many of the Jewish tradition commentators point out that it's very difficult to understand how Moshe is derived from that particular verb form. So famously, Moshe grows up in the court of Paro, in Pharaoh's household. He's raised as Egyptian, but he had been nursed by his mother because Miriam had gone up to the Egyptian princess who found him in the water and asked him if she wanted a wet nurse to take care of him. And so she, of course, gets her mother And so while they've been separated, nonetheless, Moses actually knows his true mother. The Torah doesn't describe exactly what their relationship was, how much he knew about his past, but we do know when he grows up, we're told in chapter 2 that he goes out to his kinsfolk and witness their labor. So he knows he's a Hebrew, at least in his origin. And so he goes out to see what's going on with them. And what he sees is an Egyptian taskmaster beating on a Hebrew slave. Moses looks around and he doesn't see anyone, and he ends up killing the Egyptian. Moshe then hides the Egyptian's body in the sand. And then the next day goes out, and this time he finds two Jews who are having a dispute. And when he tries to break it up, one of them says, "You're going to kill me or us like you killed the Egyptians." So Moshe knows that it's common knowledge. He flees and Pharaoh is after him, and he goes to Midian. And once again, we have the story of a well of water where the hero meets up with his future wife. He comes to a spot in Midian, and they're gathered there by the well. And then the daughters of Yitro come to water their flock, and these other guys give them a hard time. So Moshe saves them and gives them water. And then he eventually marries Yitro's daughter, Tzipporah. And she bears him a son who he named Gershom, for he said, "I've been a stranger, Ger, in a foreign land." Sham, there, a stranger there. All right, so that gives us the early background. Well, we don't know how old Moshe is, but we know, according to the biblical account, he's 80 years old when the Exodus takes place. So he's a young man at this point. And then in chapter 3, we have the famous and very important story about Moshe and the burning bush, the sneh. So Moshe is out with the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro, and he sees something off in the wilderness, a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moshe decides to go and check out this very strange situation. And as he draws near, God calls out to him from the bush, "Moshe, Moshe," and he answered, "Here I am, Hineni." Now that Hineni is frequently found throughout the Torah, throughout the Bible, as acknowledgement of presence and preparation to follow what one is being told. Okay, so Moshe recognizes God is speaking to him. One of the things that's important when one looks at this, you'll see that the name that God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and an angel of God, these two words go back and forth. Sometimes it says God speaks to him, and sometimes in this same chapter, verse 2, it says, "An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire." Then in verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush. This ambiguity or back and forth between God and his messenger, the angelic beings that are used as intermediaries, is a very frequent reality, because the malach, the angel, is really God's spokesperson, spokes-angel, whatever you want to call it, and is not independent of the divine. And so it could be in some ways lahav deal. It's like God speaks into his phone, and the words come out of the angel's mouth. However you want to view it. And so, okay, so now this whole episode is extremely important. We'll see that when we look at the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, how this entire motif plays out in their inaugurations as prophets. So anyway, so God says, take your sandals from your feet, for the place which you stand is holy ground. And then he says, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses, I am, he said, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. All right? And Moses hid his face, for he's afraid to look at God. This idea that the divine is not something that one can look at easily. It's a problem. And indeed, we find in Greek mythology that becomes an issue of looking at one of the Greek gods. We'll see this appears again later on, that one cannot simply look on the divine. So Moses is afraid, turns away, and God continues. All right, so he tells him, I know what's going on. I'm going to rescue them from the Egyptians and take them to a spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, etc., etc. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. So Moshe is told by God, I got a job for you. You're going to free my people. And Moses says, yay, yes, I'm all ready. No, that's not what happens. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? He says, who am I? I'm just a shepherd here in the middle of nowhere. And he said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign that it was I who sent you. When you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. And this is a very difficult verse itself. How can it be a sign that God sent them? That when they come to worship God at that mountain, that's after everything has happened. But nonetheless, that's what he says. All right, so now he goes on to say, Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? What is the name of God? Moshe, the Jewish people right now are in Egypt. Egypt has a multiplicity of gods, a polytheistic system. The Torah goes back and forth on the usage of the name Yud-He, Vav-He, Adonai, and Elohim. Again, we'll touch upon this later on. We talk about critical biblical studies. But Moshe wants to know, because names also are significant in terms of who or what a person, or in this case, a divinity is. So the answer that God gives to Moshe, again, there's a number of verses here, is problematic. Yomer Elohim el Moshe. God said to Moses. Now, this translation here, which is the JPS translation, they don't translate it. They just transliterate it. Eyeh asher eyeh. This how you say to the Israelites, Eyeh sent me to you. Problem is, what does Eyeh mean? Right? Now, Eyeh, in the simplest understanding, is first person singular, I, that's the Aleph part of it. Yeh will be, or I am, or I shall be. Okay, so as when the notes here in this chumash that I have, the phrase has been translated, I am that I am who I am, I will be what I will be. And it evokes Yud-He Vav-He, the specific proper name of Israel's God, known also as the Tetragrammaton, the 4 consonants. The phrase also indicates that the earliest recorded understanding of the divine name was a verb derived from a stem meaning to be or existence. You can write several books on understanding what this exactly means, but the simplest way of understanding, I believe, is that God is saying, my name is existence. I exist. The world exists. As Maimonides says in his 13 Articles of Faith, if you could imagine that the world would not exist, the universe didn't exist, God would still be there. But if you can imagine that God did not exist, the universe would not be there.
We have a question actually about the construction of the Tetragrammaton, if we might.
Sure.
So, is it a combination of Yehiyeh, Haya, and Hoeh in one word? Because
okay, you have
we
to
were
understand.
wondering.
Okay, let's start with Ehyeh. Ani Ehyeh imcha. I would say in Hebrew, I will be with you. The aleph is a preposition meaning I.
כן, אנחנו יכולים לדבר עברית. אנחנו
כן.
הבנת, אבל okay, but if you have the three tenses in one, it implies being outside the scope of time, for the creator of time cannot be encompassed by time.
That is certainly true.
So that would be the implication of the combination of these three tenses in one proper name.
I'm not sure.
That's what I'm wondering.
Okay, I'm not sure if it is a combination of them, right? Because hey yud hey being, right? In the past tense. What is the present? Present tense is hoveh, right? Now, according to some commentaries, when God's speaking, telling Moses what his name is, God is speaking, I am, or I will be, however you want to translate the being part, okay? When Moses and people refer to God, they put it in the third person. He will be. And how would you what's the indication of the third person singular? A yud. So I'm not a grammarian. I'm not a master of diktuk. And I'm sure the masters of grammar can have field days with all of the implications thereof. I do know that you're hinting at something I think is very important. When we talk about the issue of the divine direction of life, are we have free will? Does God determine things? One of the problem with that is we live on a linear time frame. We are part of time. God,
but he is not.
Is not. He is outside.
And that's why it expands to say ein rosh ve'ein guf.
Yes.
And that's sort of by way of description, but then goes on to say, by necessary implication through the combination of the three tenses, that also he is outside time, because when it says Bereshit bara et Elokim, you must the act of creation occurs in a temporal context, but from an atemporal source.
Well,
the uncreated creator.
Yeah, because the time only has meaning in the physical universe. When there's no physical
right after the act of Torah, after that,
yeah, and
very interesting.
If you're into Kabbalah and you're into the cosmology that most scientists have today, right? The Big Bang is the description that is used. What comes before the Big Bang, that's subject to debate if it's a process that goes back and forth, or it was a one-time affair. So before the universe comes into being, what is there? God, the divine. And then somehow the divine reaches across the bridge between the infinite and the finite in creating the world. And that gives rise to the whole Kabbalistic notion of emanations, which we will get to in the spring. We should get to spring soon. My wife's already tired of the winter. Good question and good insight into what God's name is. Okay, but we know that this now forms the basis of the Jewish tradition, that this is the name of God. Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter consonantal word. All right. But Moses is still hesitant. I won't go too much further, and I don't want to spend much more time. God convinces him finally he's got to go, and gives him signs to present to the Egyptians that he's into the Jews themselves. Finally, he packs up his bags, takes his wife and sons, and has a newborn son with him. They have an episode that, on their way. And then Moshe's brother Aaron, who's going to be the spokesperson. Moshe says, I can't speak. I don't know how to talk. I have problems. And God says, don't worry. Aaron will be your spokesperson. Aaron meets him, and the two of them go before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh doesn't really help them, is not very receptive to them, and makes life more miserable for the Jewish people. The Israelites are upset with Moses, and God says, wait, have patience, Moshe, you see what's going to be. Okay?
Rabbi, can we ask a question?
Of course, you can always ask, never worry about asking a question.
All right, thank you. So just about Aaron, Moses' brother. So if all the newborns would have had to have been killed, how did Aaron survive?
In between, right? There's a time frame. Okay. We know that Miriam seems to be the oldest. Miriam is born, she's a girl, so she's out of the difficulty. It's really stupid, by the way. If you want to eliminate increase in numbers and you want to have slaves, you get rid of the females, not the males. But I don't, so leave that as it may. There's also allusion to he's worried about them rebelling against him. But Yocheved, Moshe's mother, so she obviously has given birth to Miriam. She's given birth to Aaron, Aharon. And then comes the decree to throw the sons into the Nile. There's a wonderful midrash, right, which says that Miriam goes to her father and says, you are Amram, you're worse than Paro, because Paro has decreed against the boys that they should die. You who have divorced my mother and separated from her so they won't have any children, you've decreed against both the boys and the girls, because no child is coming into the world. And so he recognizes the wisdom of his daughter Miriam, and gets back together with Yocheved, and Moshe, the ultimate tool of God's salvation in Egypt, is born. So that seems to be the framework. Now the Midrash has all kinds of other things that I left out. There's some wonderful stuff if you're interested, but we could spend the entire evening just on opening Midrashim in this part of the Bible.
Okay, so basically there was a gap. So from the time Aaron was born to when Moses, that decree wasn't in place.
Well, the decree came into being between the birth of Aaron and
Right.
the birth of Moshe. That seems to be the story. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to go back to some of our Hebrew. So you have these. I still haven't sent out the books. I apologize. Eventually I'll get to it. People have asked me about a share screen. We're not there yet. Okay, I think we're up to the tzadi. Is that, does anybody remember? This would be page 27. We got up through 26, I'm pretty sure. Right? Anybody think no? All right. So we're coming to the letter tzadi. You'll sometimes heard it, people say it's a tzaddik, but that's a tzaddik means a righteous person, and tzaddik begins with this letter, but it's really tzaddik. And as you can see, there are two forms. This is the form it takes at the beginning or middle of a word. And this is the form that it takes at the end of a word, as we've had with the mem and the nun, all right? That this will only appear at the end of a word, never at the beginning. This will always appear at the beginning or in the middle of a word, but not at the end. It's pronounced like a TZ or a TS, tz, and then takes on the sound of the vowel that is associated with it. So everybody unmute yourselves. Now, when I was going over some of the answer sheets, I saw at least one person wanted to pronounce this vowel as an O, which is the Ashkenazi pronunciation. And that may be their background that they had learned it that way. We are pronouncing it though as an A because of the Sephardic pronunciation. Okay, so line number 1, everybody's unmuted. Doesn't look like it. I see microphones with lines through them. Come on down. Nobody's going to get penalized, but I want you to practice out loud. All righty. Some of you are still bashful. Okay. Line number 1, we have sa, sa, say, say, see, sai, so, and su. Okay. Line number 2,
So
8, at, rats, roots, boats, taruts. Line number 3, som, sameh, sor, surah, 8, af, oaf. Okay, 4, be'etzem, potzates, lifrots, lifarets, bitzon. Okay, line number 5, rotzeh, son, la'et, atzamot, atzma'ut. You gotta be careful from pronunciation. Atzma'ut means bones, and atzma'ut means freedom. Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Freedom Day. All right, Independence Day. And the word hamotzi means what? Brings forth. Otzi lechem min haaretz. When we say the blessing over bread, we thank God who brings forth the lechem, the bread from the earth. Okay. All right, we're going to go now to the next one. Oops. The letter het. We had the chaf before. Now we have the well. No, we have
same thing as C or F.
All right, now het is, if you get a good Arabic influence pronunciation, going back to the origin of the sound of the letter, it's really deep in the back of your throat. It's a het. It's almost, I guess it's down in your larynx, the letter het. And you can tell where an Israeli's background is, how much they emphasize that het sound. European Jews don't emphasize it as much. Jews from the Middle East, Arab-speaking lands, they will make a good het out of it. They say it's the same guttural sound as the chaf. It doesn't really, but for most people, that's all the difference they're going to make. But the chaf, versus the het, the chaf is really at the top of your throat, and the het is back down in your throat. So do it as you want. When we come to Hanukkah, that's why it's, how do you write a het in English? So CH is often chosen for that sound in what they call scientific transliterations. The letter H with a dot under it is used to indicate the chet. The chaf is a KH, and when it's the kaf, it's just the letter K. So for those of you who want to look up how to pronounce things in scientific nomenclature. All right, but it's the letter chet. If you say chet, I'm not going to give you a hard time. If you say het, that's okay too. All righty. So clear your throats, because they're going to need to clear by the time you finish. All right. Line number 1, we have ho, hey, cha, chai, che, chi, ho, chi, che, and he. All right, I almost made the mistake too. See, the difference between the chet and the hey is a little bit of empty space. Otherwise, they're identical. Top left corner has got a little gap in it. Okay, line number 2. Rach, nach, hom, cham, hem, chutz, chol, hol. All right, line number 3. Haran, chof, chetz, chotz, rahat, chalutz. All right, line number 4. Chalutzi, beratzon, chatzil, chatzif, and chatich. Line number 5. Rachel, Rachamim, Rechem, Chataf, and Chatefa. Line 6. Chalitza, Zalachat, Zohelet, Chai, Yim, Chaim. All right. Line 7. Chalom, Techef, Egel, Gilcha, Tachana, Atipach. And lechem means bread. Now, bread is defined as flour that is made from wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye, mixed with water into a dough that is baked or cooked on in an oven some way, or top of a grill. Okay, that's lechem. And we'll talk about it in Pesach time, because on Pesach we don't ban lechem, because matzah is a form of lechem. Okay, if I'm eating a piece of matzah today, I don't eat it because I can't. Well, if I have oat matzah. If I eat an oat matzah today, the bracha for that would be hamotzi lechem in haaretz. When I have my oat challahs on Shabbos, it's hamotzi lechem in haaretz. The difference is leavening, and we will hold off until Pesach for that. Okay? Now, a little anomaly. The letter chet, when it's at the end of a word, and it has the vowel, the patach vowel under it, okay? Instead of pronouncing it as cha, it's pronounced as ach. So to give the example here, it's pronounced ach instead of cha. Understand that? That has to do with pronunciation issues and things, and the development of language, and I don't know all the rationales and everything for it, but reich is kind of difficult, but Re'ach is easier. I don't know. So let's look at our examples here. Line number 1. Re'ach, Re'ach, Lu'ach, Yare'ach, Pote'ach, Ru'ach. Line number 2. Rotze'ach, Irtzach, Retzu'ach, Betoch, Donacha, Betoch. That's why I like them out. All right. And the last one is Lachatz. Line number 3. Minoach, Minoach, Menucha, Menucha, Menuach. See, when I was talking about the difference, if I could do it correctly, this would be Menuach, Menucha, and this would be Menuha. Slight difference there, but like I said, don't worry about it. Line number 4, we're going to have an apple. Tapuach, Poteach, Meniach, Tzomeach, Lahochiach. And line 5, Moach, Lehit, Pateach, Lehit, Pateach, Betucha. By the way, I said tapuach is an apple. Tapuach is an apple, and a potato is tapuach adama. Just like in French, you have pomme and pomme de terre. So in Hebrew, it's tapuach de terre, tapuach adama. Same thing working there. The Bible doesn't know from potatoes. Okay, so now let's read together the bracha that we make over the bread. Okay, ready? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Okay. They translate, bless you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. It's very strange. When was the last time you saw bread coming out of the earth? So a question was asked, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God creates the wheat kernel, but it's human beings who turn it into bread. And so it's a combination together with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I'll open that. But
is Rabbi,
yes.
is the bracha like that because of the manna during the
I don't know.
during the exile?
I really don't know the answer. Why that is done that way. But let's see. That's not working the way I want it. I don't want to share the screen anymore at the moment. All right. Okay. Tonight we're going to start going into the Jewish literature in the general sense, specifically starting with the Tanakh and then going into rabbinic literature following that. First and foremost, there's a big difference between, say, the Bible and the Old Testament. As far as we are concerned, there is no such thing as an Old Testament. There's the Hebrew Bible, and there is, that's it. Just a second. Okay. I'm not sure at what stage of history, but when the New Testament was entitled in English, New Testament, the word testament had the meaning of agreement, of covenant. All right? So the New Testament meant the new covenant between Israel of the Spirit versus the old covenant of Israel of the flesh. So what it is really is a statement that the New Testament supersedes the Old Testament. The new is always better than the old, according to some people. Some of us older people think that's not necessarily true. But we do not refer to our Bible as the Old Testament. You may have run a situation where that's the only way it makes understandable people you're talking to, but we prefer either the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scriptures, or the Tanakh. Now, the word Tanakh comes from an abbreviation for the three sections of the Bible. And it's three letters. The Tav is for Torah. The Nun is for Navi or Naviim, prophets. The Chaf is for Ketuvim, the writings. So the Torah is the first 5 books of the 24 books of the Bible. We're going to review those in a few minutes and talk about that. Now,
Sorry, Rabbi, can you just previously you were saying about the word testament meaning covenant. So you're saying sort of the Christian view is that the Hebrew Bible is a physical covenant, and the Christian Bible
it was a covenant with
spiritual.
Well, it was a covenant with the people of Israel, the physical people of Israel. And Christians replace that covenant. So it's no longer between God and one particular people. It's between all those who accept Jesus, thus the Spirit. The physical was the covenant between God and Israel, the Jewish people, versus God and those people who come to God through the Spirit, if I understand it correctly.
Okay.
You know, I don't know if we talked about this specifically, but you know, when Christianity begins, without going into the New Testament's validity, invalidity, I'm not arguing that. Obviously, as a Jew, I don't believe the accuracy of the New Testament, right? But when you look carefully at the New Testament, the early stories of the New Testament, the earliest Christians were all Jews. When Christianity begins to expand beyond its original Jewish source, roots, the question arises, in order to be a Christian, do you have to be a Jew? Do you have to follow the laws that Jews follow? Most importantly, kashrut and circumcision. Okay? And the New Testament records a debate amongst the early followers of Jesus, in which the side that says, no, you do not have to be Jewish, wins. And so Christianity separates itself from Judaism at that moment. Just whatever the whole God thing, Son, Father, Spirit, all of that stuff doesn't really develop until Paul and later. The earliest part seems to be that the earliest Jewish Christians, Christian Jews, whatever you want to call them, believed that Jesus was the Messiah. When they make this break that you no longer have to follow the laws of the Torah, you have to have a doctrinal explanation for that, the theological explanation. And that explanation is the Torah represents the old covenant between God given at Sinai to Israel versus the new covenant that comes into being with the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. So Old Testament, New Testament is actually a statement of theological supersessionism, that Christianity supersedes Judaism. Right? Now, to give you an idea, now when we talk about the Tanakh, okay. I got to do something here because I can't see it. There we go. All right. I will send this to you by email later. But what I've done here is given you an outline of the 24 books of the Tanakh. So we start with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and I also have their English names, and with just a brief kind of summation of what's to be found in it. So the first third are the 5 books of Moses. The next portion is referred to as Nevi'im, or prophets. Former prophets, later prophets, really the later prophets are starting with Isaiah, but anyway. So you have 6, 7, 8, and 9 are more or less historical books. Right? Sefer Yehoshua, Joshua tells the story of the conquest of the land of Canaan. Shoftim tells the story of the judges between the time of Joshua and Samuel. Shmuel, Aleph, and Bet, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the story of Samuel's leadership over the tribes, then of Saul as king of Israel, and finally as David. And it continues to just about the end of David's life. Now, we refer to these as 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, there really is no absolute need to have these divided into 2, 1st and 2nd. It's theorized that because of the size of the text, the book, and the size of a parchment scroll to contain it would have been too much to have both books in one scroll, and therefore becomes divided into 2 books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. But you notice in my numbering, it's not listed as a separate book. 1st and 2nd Samuel is one book in the 24 numbering of the books of the Bible. Similarly, Malachim, Kings 1 and 2, Malachim Aleph and Bet, which tells the history of Israel from the time of the death of David and his successor Solomon taking over, to the destruction of the temple and the Babylonian exile and aftermath. Again, it's divided into 2 parts, 1st and 2nd, but it has no absolute reason for that again, except probably due to the size of the book. 10, Yeshaya or Yeshayahu, Isaiah, 8th century BCE. And as we'll look at some of these passages in a couple of weeks, which have a lot of sections that have messianic overtones and were used by Christians in debates over the nature of Jesus. So Isaiah is active in 8th century BCE, the time of the Assyrian conquest of the north. Assyria conquers the northern tribes in 722 BCE. The next one, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, is a prophet at the end of the 7th century, the beginning of the 6th century, and he lives through the destruction in 586 BCE of the temple. All right. And then Yechezkel, Ezekiel, is the prophet of the exile. He's exiled to Babylonia, addresses the Jews at that time of the need and speaks of the future restoration. So those are books 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of the 24. The next 12 books are called in Hebrew the Treasar, the 12 minor prophets. There's nothing necessarily minor about them, just that their books are much shorter than the other prophetic works. Okay? And so we have some names that make their way into English. It gives us difficulty. Obadiah, Ovadia, or Habakkuk. That's another great one. The last of the prophets, according to Jewish tradition, is Malachi. That's the last of the Treasar, last of the 12 minor prophets. And according to rabbinic tradition, the age of prophecy ends with the prophet Malachi. So it's appropriate that his book concludes the section known as the prophets, the section of Nevi'im. Now, the last section is called Ketuvim, the writings. And Ketuvim is kind of a mixed bag, and there are various ways of trying to understand the relationship. One of the modern approaches is to see most of these as consisting what would be considered wisdom literature. And because, for example, Mishlei and Proverbs, Job, have nothing necessarily Jewish associated with them. The ideas and images could be found in any culture. Shir HaShirim, which we'll talk about more, is love poetry. Ruth is now another historical work. That's why in Christian Bibles, Ruth is sometimes placed around the book of Judges. Eicha is laments for the destruction of the temple. Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, again, is a work that could just as easily be found in other cultures. Although there's a Jewish element to it, basically, it's an essay on the futility or vanity of human life. Esther tells the story of Mordechai and Esther, the story for Purim. That's what I'm Talmudic studies right now. The Daf Yomi is doing a Sefer Megillah, which is the Talmudic section about Esther. Daniel is, I wrote a prophet, although he's not found amongst the prophets, but we do find him in the court of Nebuchadnezzar offering guidance to the king and the various other stories around him. But he's not really a prophet in the sense that he goes and speaks to the people. Ezra and Nehemiah, again, these two are put together in the Jewish context as one book. And it tells the return of the Jews to the land of Israel. And then finally, Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, again, 1 and 2, history of the Jewish people from brief pre-kingdom review through the end of the destruction. Okay, so I will send those out to you this later on, so you will have them. Okay. Now, when we look at the Bible in its entirety, it's very clear to someone with an open approach that it doesn't necessarily always follow the same party line. There are variations, different perspectives on seeing the world. Certainly by putting it together in one book, by having it understood to being a holy text, the Jewish people made it into a collective work and made it the Bible. But as you see, when you look at Ecclesiastes, for example, versus Deuteronomy, they have a very different voice and sound to how they look at the world. We will look at Ecclesiastes in a little bit of detail later on, but you should know that. So we don't know for sure when the Bible, as we think of as the Bible, comes into existence, into being. There were no Bibles. There were books. Each one of the books of the Bible, except for the Torah, were separate works. And you could find scrolls from the different books. As a matter of fact, of the 24 books of the Bible, all but the Megillat Esther, all but this, except for the book of Esther, were found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the most famous and most well-preserved of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah is readable. You can, they don't really send out the real book of Isaiah. You don't really see it anymore. It's because it would ruin the book. But if you look at a picture of it, which is what they really display now, they had it here in Toronto a few years ago, back before the pandemic. I can read it. The Hebrew letters are the same form and format that we have today. They're not written in the old Hebrew. They're written in what we call in the Talmud Ktav Ashuri, the Assyrian alphabet. But it is indicative of the fact that all of the 24 books, except maybe for Esther, since that was not found in Qumran, obviously had importance already at that period of history when that collection came into being. There are other works there too that are not accepted in Jewish tradition. As I said, the New Testament, let's start back. Malachi was said to be the last of the prophets. Malachi is around the time before the entrance of Alexander the Great into the Middle East. The rabbi said for any book to be included in the Bible, although they don't use that language, it has to have come before the time of Alexander the Great. Again, they don't say that way, but that's essentially what they did. By making that decision, they eliminated any other works, including all what becomes the New Testament, the Apocrypha, and other kinds of works like that, from receiving the imprimatur of the rabbinic movement. It's interesting. How do we know that a book is a holy book? The rabbis say it's matamei yadayim. If you touch it with your hands, you cannot touch consecrated food with your hand without washing your hand off. Very, it's counterintuitive. It is that which is the most important of books renders your hands impure. Why? Because apparently they would store the books with food, and often with food that was considered to be special food, truma and masa, that sort of thing. And food attracts mice and rats, and they would eat the food, and they also would eat the parchment scrolls. So in order to make sure you kept them away from the rats, they said, if you touch them, the scroll, you can't, and you touch the food, you render the food ritually impure. And that way you had to store them in different places.
So you mentioned that like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were other books that are not accepted. Are there like the Apocrypha and other books? Are there things? What I was going to ask is just are there books that would be considered, whether it's midrash or like part of Jewish like academic thought, even though it's not accepted as holy as being part of the Tanakh?
Okay, now it depends on how you examine that period of history. The traditionalist view, I'm going to give you that right now. The traditionalist view is that God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. We'll talk about that yet. And then he handed over the Masorah, the tradition, the oral Torah, Moshe Bel Torah, Sinai, Masorah, Yoshua, Shua, Zakanim, Sam, Levim. Moses received Torah at Sinai, gave it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That chain of tradition that goes down to the Mishnah and the Talmud. If it's not in that chain of tradition, it's not Jewish. Okay? Now we know that while the rabbis were saying this, there were the Sadducees. And the Sadducees didn't necessarily agree with everything that the rabbis said, the Pharisees. We know that there was the community of Qumran, where the Essenes were. We assume they're Essenes, we don't know. Josephus refers to Essenes and other groups within Israel. Now, some historians will say these were all manifestations of Judaism, including early Christianity. They were all part of Second Temple, late Second Temple period Judaism. And only after the destruction of the temple do we have a divergence. So that Christianity takes its path, Rabbinic Judaism, the Pharisees, Rabbinic Judaism takes its path. They deny the worth value of the other. And any other kinds of groups that may have been around at that time slowly disappear. So either you talk about there was Judaism and everything else, or you say there were Judaisms that finally winnowed out until we have what we have today. Modern historians prefer the latter. Traditionalist historians, especially in the Orthodox world, prefer the former. It's much messier. The second is much messier. And now I'll get into a little bit of that. Because, for example, we say we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not every element that is found in the Hebrew scriptures that we have today is identical with the versions found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, Isaiah is very close, but there are some differences, some very minor, sometimes just spelling differences where you spell it, we call full spelling or shorter spelling. Sometimes there's more than that. Furthermore, we know that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Torah. It was done sometime in the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era. And there are differences here and there that are not just simply choices of translation. There are passages that do not agree with the Hebrew scriptures that we have. What we have today is called the Masoretic text, the text of the Masoretes. The Masorah means the tradition. And even there we have a few discrepancies here and there. But if you pick up a Torah scroll in Toronto and you pick up a Torah scroll in Bangkok, they will prove to be pretty much identical. Because the Masoretes preserved and they counted every letter. They made sure the way it was written, the paragraphing was the same. If a book didn't match that, that was rejected as being an authentic text. But there are a couple of discrepancies here and there. Sometimes we will find that even a chumash that you get in a synagogue might have a slight variation from something else. But that Masoretic text has become the text for the Jewish people. So any traditional Hebrew scriptures, Jewish scriptures, the Tanakh, derives from the Masoretic formulation of it. But there are issues. For example, I mentioned that the story of King Saul is found in Samuel. Well, there's a chapter that begins and literally says when Saul was 2 years old, which makes no sense whatsoever. It probably is a reference to the 2nd year of Saul's reign. But those words aren't there. However, I believe in the Septuagint, the words are there. Now, did they get lost? Were they added? That becomes a subject of debate. We have other places as well. One that we will look at when we come to Isaiah is that there is a passage in Isaiah that talks about an Alma giving birth. Is Alma the same as Betula? Two Hebrew words. One means a young woman. whether or not she is a virgin. Betula means a virgin. The Septuagint adopts a translation that means a virgin. Now, one can debate whether or not that's what they meant it to mean. Excuse me, because even in Hebrew, you can have some discrepancy. But that gives rise to the whole issue of the virgin birth of Jesus because of the Septuagint's translation of that word. So even
sorry, I was just gonna say, because I listened to like a 3-hour debate like a few weeks ago from Rabbi Mizrahi and a Christian apologist, and they were debating about this exact thing, Alma, and all the modern Hebrew speakers understand it one way, and then all the Christian theologians take it from the Greek. But then, and they were even going into things like Emmanuel, if that actually was a person, you know, or was that actually a reference to Messiah? So so these like non-accepted, but still obviously coming from some semblance of Jewish tradition, whether it was the Sadducees or other groups, would, like, from a sort of observance, or, you know, I mean, as we're all converting, is it still like encouraged to read these things and like study them? Like when you go to yeshiva, do you still look at some of the other books at all?
Especially yeshiva. You go to yeshiva, anything that's not a good Jewish text that the rabbi considers to be okay is verboten, forbidden. The rabbis in the Talmud era also, they talk back and forth about whether or not you're really supposed to be reading other works, and that's a long discussion that we find in Jewish tradition. But if we, let's put it this, I'm oversimplifying a lot, but we know, maybe this comes up because I'm listening to a podcast about the history of the Haitian Revolution. At one time in history, slavery was part of the world, right? We know that the Declaration of the Rights of Men, the American Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all of these things talked about freedom and free men. Well, first of all, men, not women, were given rights. Secondly, Blacks in America were not given rights. They were slaves. They were not even counted as an individual for the census. So a reading of that at that period of time would accept the notion, whether you like it or not, that there are free people and there are slaves. The law today, the accepted law interpretation is slavery is not permitted. Can you read about somebody who wrote defending slavery? You want to, sure. But I certainly wouldn't put it on any high school curriculum to, if I would teach ethics and morals today, I'm not going to put up such a work to read. It's rejected, I hope anyway, by modern people, that no one should be a slave, regardless of anything. And this passage is not right. Was it right one time? Maybe. Was it debatable at one time? Maybe. So for example, we talked about kashrut. There's a statement in the Talmud that says there was a rabbi who allowed his community to have fowl with dairy. That is no longer accepted. You cannot act on it. Can you read about it? Yes. Can you act upon it? No. If you want to read about Sadducean interpretation, that's very good for a historical analysis of things dealing with the rabbinic tradition. Modern scholars do that. As a matter of fact, they sometimes reconstruct what the Sadducees said from what the rabbi said in opposition to them. Very clearly, that's what, I mean, we have a few passages in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that seem to reflect Sadducean practice. But that's was then, this is now, that's on the outside, and the other books are on the inside. So for example, you got rabbi, when I studied in university, Yeshiva University no less, we read the New Testament parts because of the reflections of the history of the New Testament. It reflect upon the rabbinic period. I read it for history. I didn't read it for theology. Right? I could read a Sadducean tract, perhaps, to give me an idea of what they thought the law should be, but I don't read it in order to establish what Jewish tradition should be. Answer your question? For the moment, huh?
Yeah, yeah. Oh well, the only thing that I was sort of thinking in the back of my head about all of this is that, like, pre 1700s, with the advent of the Reform movement, and you have this sort of very sort of traditional bubble.
Yeah, we're going to have to get
And-
into that now. We're going to go into that now a little bit.
Oh, okay, and then on the same vein, if you look at like the Karaite Jews, for example, and whether or not they extend from the Sadducees or not, or other groups and stuff like
Well,
that.
they don't come
then-
from the Sadducees, but they were accused of being Sadducees because that was a convenient label to throw on.
Right. And they obviously reject like
Rabbinic
oral law
tradition.
versus
They
and
reject-
rabbinic tradition. And but yet when it comes to like halacha in terms of who's considered a Jew and things like that, then you have this like sort of weird
Yeah.
acceptance of some and rejection of others. And I was just curious, like from at least from an academic perspective, how
okay.
that works.
All right. For lack, essentially, what we say that if you're Jewish, you're Jewish, you're Jewish. You can't get away from it, no matter what you do. You can be a heretic, to use an English term. You could be an absolute sinner. You can eat ham sandwiches in front of the synagogue, listening to your radio on Yom Kippur, but you're still a Jew. You're sinning. Yisrael, even though he's a sinner, he's still a Jew. Okay? And you can never, we're very, we don't let go. Once you're a Jew, you can never not be a Jew. You might believe something that's improper. You might do something that's not right. But yet you're a Jew. Now, for example, I really didn't read any details of it. There was I think he was a bishop, I forget, in the Catholic Church who just recently died, who wanted a Jewish funeral. He was survivor of the Holocaust. He was sent to be saved from the Holocaust in a Christian circumstance. He becomes a Christian, becomes a priest, et cetera, but he wanted to recognize his Jewish heritage. So apparently he was buried I don't know if it was in the Jewish cemetery or not. That's an interesting question, or what part of the cemetery, what have you. Okay. I do know a few years ago, there was a local gentleman who was very active in the Jews for Jesus, proselytizing Jews to become Christians. And when he died, he wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. And one of the few things that all the rabbis of the various denominations agreed upon was that he should not be buried in the Jewish cemetery because of his stand. Was he Jewish? Yes. Was he deserving of burial in a Jewish cemetery? No, because of what he had been preaching. Okay. There was a man, Brother Daniel, he was known as. Similar case. He was born Jewish, saved from the Holocaust, and became a monk. He wanted to move to Israel under the law of return, which guarantees any Jew the right to come to Israel. The Israeli Supreme Court, making clear that they're not deciding this in accordance with Jewish law, halacha, said by accepting another faith, he removed himself from being able to claim heritage amongst the Jewish people. A rabbinic court would probably have disagreed. Now, whether or not they would agree to the law of return being used, that's neither here nor there, but he was Jewish under halakha. Okay. Now, let's get to the part that I have to get to tonight before we reach midnight. All right. If you pick up Maimonides and look at his 13 Articles of Faith and however the format that they are written today, he argues that every single word, line found in the Torah was given by God to Moses at Sinai. There's nothing added, nothing missing. That's exactly what Moses got at Sinai. The simplest way of seeing it is as if Moshe was simply a stenographer taking down the dictation of God. Right? And that, in some form or another, served as the basic Jewish idea up until the modern era. While there were rabbis who suggest a line or two or something like this may have been added by a prophet later on, or the rabbis may have made some certain decisions about certain wording, ultimately it was seen as being the word of God given to Moses, thus serving as a underpinning of Jewish theology, Jewish law. If it's from in the Torah, it's a law from God. It may be subject to various interpretations, but it cannot be ruled out, thrown out, disobeyed. In the modern era, as we start getting already, the philosopher Spinoza began to question whether or not the Bible, the Torah, represents the word of God to Moses at Sinai. And he comes up with a negative. By the middle of the 19th century, there arose a school of thought that suggested that the Torah was really an amalgamation of different books that at some stage of history were brought together, edited poorly, perhaps, and made into what we call now the 5 books of Moses. And they see differences in different passages indicating the different sources. So, for example, if you look at the story of creation, in chapter 1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, God created heaven and earth. Day 1, day 2, day 3, 4, 5, and 6, through heavens and earth being finished, at the beginning of chapter 2. Of a certain style of recording creation. Beginning after the first few verses of chapter 2, God is called Adonai Elohim. The Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Tetragrammaton, is used in conjunction with Elohim. And the story of creation follows a different kind of pattern, certainly a different kind of storytelling. And so the assumption was that chapter 1 was from the hand of one tradition. If I recall correctly, the Elohistic tradition, the E document. It was a priestly. Chapter 2 was said to be the E document, where chapter 1 follows priestly feelings, while chapter 2 has a different theology that's operating. Anyway, this whole approach eventually becomes known as the documentary hypothesis. It was associated with a man by the name of Wellhausen, who was known to be an anti-Semite, who had an agenda as part of it. But the essential idea of the Torah being a human creation, edited at some stage in time, containing 4 basic documents, the J, the E, the P, and the D, became standard operating hypothesis for liberal theological schools, whether they be Jewish or Protestant or Catholic. Now, that has been challenged. First of all, it was challenged at the very beginning by traditionalists, both in the Jewish camp and non-Jewish camp, and the debates therein. But you will see that in the modern, the Jewish Theological Seminary, at the Reformed Seminary, at all of the liberal Jewish institutions. This is taken, this idea that the Torah is some kind of human documentation pretty much predominates. Now, part of the problem is where does God fit into that plan? How does he make it? And that's different. Scholars have different ways of trying to resolve that issue. The traditionalist school in Orthodox circles, for the main part, reject 100% this whole idea. Part of the reason being that they base it on the idea that prophecy, as we understand it, can't be true because people can't see the future the way the prophets are operating. And they deal with some of the other books of the Bible as well that way. But rabbinic tradition was all built upon the idea that it was a unified work coming from the time of Moses. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. One end is basically a human created document that is a result of the combination of earlier documents, traditions, what have you. Some of them contradict each other. They were edited together, sometimes smoothly, sometimes not so smoothly. If you look at the story of Noah, and you can supposedly separate two different variants on the story of Noah and the ark, and that explains certain other places where there seem to be contradictions or problems in the biblical text. I personally am not big on this.
So I was just going to ask, could you, when you were mentioning the documentary hypothesis, before that, you said after Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, you said there was another philosopher that challenged that?
Well, no.
Forget the name.
Not directly. No. Oh, Spinoza.
Okay.
Spinoza.
Yeah.
The famous heretic Spinoza. Yeah, Spinoza was famously excommunicated by his synagogue in Amsterdam. And it was all in the news recently because a Jewish philosopher, academic, wanted to take some videos in the synagogue that Spinoza had been excommunicated from. And the rabbi said, no, you can't do that. He was excommunicated, he stays excommunicated. And if you are going to be teaching his teachings, you are excommunicated. You're not allowed to be in the synagogue. But then the lay leadership said, what are you talking about, Rabbi? He can come in and do it if he wants. All right, but so the whole, it's still a live issue. Should Spinoza have been excommunicated? And does the excommunication still apply? And who cares whether it applies or not? That's still there. Okay, I don't know a whole lot of Spinoza's philosophy, but he does challenge traditional Jewish philosophy very much. All right, but he was a scholar without any question in Judaism. Okay, we have been reading Genesis. That's one of the reasons why I make sure to give you the weekly Torah portion. So you've had an overview of Sefer Breshit over the course of time. Okay? Very clearly, it has a linear development. It begins with creation, tells the story of certain human attributes, human history, the divisions after the time of the flood into different languages, and then the beginnings of the Jewish people under Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons and their descent into Egypt. Exodus, which we will be going over, so I won't go too far into it right now. Exodus continues that story. Exodus, as we said tonight, begins with a recounting of Israel being in Egypt, the recounting of their being made into slaves, the birth of Moses, and Moses's inauguration as a leader of Israel and as the first of the prophets. And Moses is going to be the major figure for the rest of the Bible, rest of the Torah. He is pictured as essentially being a recipient of God's word, it never clearly spells out how the Torah itself comes into being. We know that, for example, the Talmud argues, who wrote the last 11 verses of Deuteronomy? Because the last verses of Deuteronomy tell about the death of Moses. So one rabbi says, Joshua wrote it. After Moses died, Joshua finished up the Torah by writing that. Another rabbi would not have that. He couldn't open the door for even Joshua to finish telling the story of Moses. And so he says Moses wrote out about his death and the mourning for him with tears in his eyes. He foresaw what was going to be. He writes it down, including his death and his hidden burial and the people of Israel mourning for him. So again, you have one rabbi willing to, and this is the Talmudic era, willing to accept at least some addition to it, another rabbi nodding at all. We know that there are other passages that seem to be anachronistic. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. When you say at that time they were in the land, what do you mean then? From what perspective? The perspective of the story or the perspective now? So Ibn Ezra famously says that one of the later prophets stuck that in to clarify that passage in the Torah. He was attacked for that by Nachmanides, not Maimonides, but Nachmanides, who essentially says, and elsewhere in a different source, he should have molten gold poured down his throat. At least it was gold.
Rabbi, I just have a quick question. How much time was there between like Joseph and Moses being born? Or do we know?
Well, the account is the Israelites are enslaved for 210 years. That says when they leave Egypt, 210 years. All right, so Moses is 80 when they leave Egypt. So that means 210, so it means 130 years of slavery before Moses was born. Joseph dies at 110. So 100 years? I don't remember exactly. You know, the back of some of the Chumashim I've got could give me the exact dating that they counted out. All right, but it's a few generations. So how did Israel become so big in that short period of time? The Israelites were very fruitful. They multiplied tremendously. Every time a Jewish woman gave birth, she gave birth to 6 children. Imagine that, ladies, 6 children at a time. All right, one's hard enough, and that's the Midrash. It doesn't say that in the Torah. All right, and so but we have other periods of Jewish history in which Jewish population growth has been very rapid. So it's it's not out of the possibilities of that quick development. Anything else?
Like how many families there, Jewish families, or number of Jews are approximated to be in each of that? Because you would think with Joseph, it's literally a handful of families leading up to an entire nation.
Yeah, look, when it comes to the census that the Bible has there, it's very problematic. I would say that the simplest answer, it's hard to deal with, because you have 50 people go down to Egypt, right? And it says at the beginning, where is it? At the end of Genesis. Well, the very beginning of Exodus is Jacob, each coming with his household, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Judah, Yissachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70. Joseph already being in Egypt, and Joseph, all right, so they were 70 come down, one big family. Just to show you how it's possible, I have two brothers. One has got 10 kids. If each of his 10 kids have only 5, and most of them have more than that have been married, that's between 50 and 100 grandchildren. And if that, let's go with a lower number, 50 grandchildren. If those 50 grandchildren, right, have 5 children, we're at 250 in 3 generations. Now, if more of them go towards the 10 children side of the equation, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000. How long does that take? So be fruitful and multiply if you want to have a lot of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, what have you. I've got 3, that's fine with me. I was one of 5. So far, my oldest has 7 and the youngest has 2, but we'll see what the youngest is going to be doing. Okay, all right.
Rabbi, I was curious one thing, because you mentioned, you know, like on the back of your Humash, it had the dates and stuff. It just reminded me of a question. What is, like, as we're going through like sort of Torah learning, what is like the significant difference or considerations? Because like I noticed like Etz Chaim Humash that we have in the conservative shuls, I also own the Stone edition, which I know is in the Orthodox shuls, and it's like very different in terms of how the commentary is and what is to be gained or what's to be lost by not reading one or the other or both, that sort of thing.
Okay. Remember I said about liberal seminaries, which Etz Chaim is a representative of, coming from the liberal perspective. They will, in Etz Chaim, you have reference to the documentary Hypothesis, a more historical analysis of the biblical stories, more open to critical thinking and questioning. The Art Scroll Chumash, not only is it Orthodox, but only goes to the most right wing of Orthodox. Okay? And so it is absolutely accepting of the idea that God gave the Torah in its entirety to Moses at Sinai. The Midrashic interpretations of the Torah are to be understood fairly literally and as being true on a literal level. For example, the 6 children that are born to each woman. This is my Art Scroll one. Let's see. Gosh. That's why you're supposed to have various books. Where is it? I don't see it here per se, but the way to look at it, if you want to know what traditional Jewish commentaries had on the Bible, and only that, you can find that in the Art Scroll. If you want to have both traditional and modern commentary, you will find it in Etz Chaim. because they have both some of the traditional interpretations are taken into account, as well as many modern traditions and examinations. I just want to finish up briefly now with the overview of Exodus. Right, so we have the story, and we will go over these parshas as we go through the year. So we have the struggle between Moshe and Paro, or really between God and Paro, to let Israel go free. It culminates with the Seder night, and then the crossing of the sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army there. Makes its way to Sinai, where God delivers at least the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, and other laws and ritual laws to Moshe at Sinai. It then turns to a discussion of the building of a tabernacle, a place to worship God, the sacrificial system that will be established there. It then relates what happens when Moses comes down from the mountain and Israel's apostasy of the golden calf. And then it concludes with the story of the construction and dedication of that tabernacle. It also got some general laws, as in Sefer Mishpatim, for Jewish life. So it moves from the account of the Jews in Egypt to the account of the Jews receiving Torah at Sinai, of creating the sacrificial system with the tabernacle in the middle of Israel, and it ends with those accounts. Okay. So in a nutshell, please keep in mind, we do not have an Old Testament. We have the Torah, the Bible. The Bible traditionally in Jewish circles is 24 books divided into 3 major sections, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, called the Tanakh. And rabbinic tradition sees God as the ultimate, as the author of the Torah. Modern critical theories have various ways of approaching that. And that also, and when we talk about approaches to Jewish law and tradition, will play a very significant role in how we understand that. Okay. All right,
Rabbi
so,
Berman, very
yes.
quick question for you. Earlier, you were going to give your opinion on that, like
Okay.
the 2 camps of the Torah.
What I have to say is this: I see certain benefits in seeing variations within the story, but I find it becomes problematic. The best approach is one that Professor David Weiss Livni, Should Live and Be Well, suggests as the following. And I kind of buy into it, whether or not it's accurate or not, I'm not arguing, but I'm accepting it on faith. God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. When Moses comes down from Sinai, he sees that Israel's already sinning. We know that during the time of the kings of Israel, there are all kinds of problems. We know that when King Josiah comes to the throne towards the end of the period of the Judean, of the kingdom of Judah, he finds a book that tells them how to properly observe Pesach, which apparently they did not know about. And we find in the Torah today passages that have one word written in the Torah, and we're told we read it a different way, sometimes a totally separate word altogether. So Professor Weiss Livni suggests that during the time following, almost immediately after the Torah is given, Israel begins to sin. Israel begins to lose proper sanctity over the Torah. The Torah gets corrupted. It gets all kinds of lacuna that come into it, absences, things that come about. After the Babylonian exile, Ezra the scribe takes what he can find and tries to reconstruct the original text that Moses had at Sinai. Because he can't be 100% certain about certain elements, he has to put in possibilities like one word written there and saying on the side that you read it differently. And that therefore takes care of what seems to be problems of meshing certain stories, because Ezra did the best that he could. There's a couple of places in the Torah, I mentioned it, where they have dots over letters. We had a few weeks ago when Esau and Jacob met again, Vayishakehu, and they kissed each other. You may remember that. So the Vayishakehu is dotted over it. So according to the Talmud, this comes from Ezra. And he says, when Elijah comes to Ezra in the end of days, or when Ezra goes to Elijah after the resurrection, whatever it may be, and Elijah says to him, why did you write Vayishakehu, and they kissed each other, or they kissed in the Torah? He says, I didn't know for sure if it belonged there or not, so I put dots over it. Okay, so it doesn't belong. If Elijah says, why did you put dots over it? Just to be sure, but it's there, right? So it's okay. So we had both ways. Dots it because there's a question, but he puts it in there. So maybe Elijah will decide whether it really belongs there or not, and we'll find out. But the reality is, no matter what, the Torah, as anything, has to have a human element to it. It doesn't say that God wrote down on a scroll every word that we find in the Torah. It says that God revealed to Moses at Sinai, is the way the rabbis describe it. And all of you are listening to me tonight, and all of you are going to come away from this evening having heard different things. Sometimes I'm sure you'll have heard things that are contradictory, because you're human and I'm human. But let's say I'm not human, I'm godlike. Nonetheless, you hear. You have to interpret what you hear. And God didn't speak in a voice. Somehow God communicates with Moses, and Moses has to take that communication and put it down. So even Moses had to deal with the problem of transmitting that which was the divine message into human words and putting it on parchment. And then scribes over the course of centuries had to copy it. And as much as traditionalists want to say they never made any mistakes, there's certainly some scribal errors here and there in the Torah, because it happens today. I'll conclude with this. Many years ago, when I was a rabbi in Denver, the Balkor, the fellow who was reading the Torah, is reading a passage, and I corrected him because he made a mistake. So he goes over it again. He says the same thing, and I corrected him. He does it a third time. I corrected him. I said, wait a minute, what's going on here? You can't make the same mistake 3 times. Go up to the Torah. It was a Torah scroll that was rarely used in that synagogue. And when it was used, it was rolled to a different passage. When that scroll was written, the person who wrote it, the scribe, made a mistake. And nobody caught it. Until one day, we happened to be reading the passage where the mistake was. And I heard what he read. The Baal Koreh, the reader, read what was in front of him. He correctly read what was in front of him, but what was in front of him was incorrect. Okay? It's as if the Declaration of Independence said, we know it says all men are created equal. And if somebody, somebody changes, all women are created equal. And if I read it that way, I'd be reading correctly what's in front of me, but that's not what Thomas Jefferson wrote. Either somebody was being silly or what have you, wanted to correct it. All men and women are created equal. Human elements enter into it, just right. I came to Canada in '94, and all of thy sons command. Right? Wasn't that our national anthem? And now it's an all of us command, right? So things change. Sometimes humans can change it. And sometimes humans change it without permission, what have you, I don't know. I'll share that with you when we come to Pesach. I have a wonderful thing that I like to do on Pesach about corrections in the Haggadah. You have to wait till then. So you have to stay on track to be with me when we get to Passover. Okay, anything else? All righty. If you have questions about the Torah and all of that, of course, you're certainly welcome to agree, disagree with me, and certainly to talk with your sponsoring rabbi. And I'm sure he or she will be happy to share with you what they believe. And you can push them on it if you want. Tell them I said you had to. Okay, good night, everybody.